and welcome to How and When to Say No, the guide for freelancers who sometimes struggle with turning down work or worrying about upsetting clients while asserting boundaries. I will be your presenter today. I am widely known as an ALA. I'm also Jessica Eanes, depending on which hat I'm wearing when you talk to me. I have done a ton of freelancing. I've done a ton of work in sales. I've done a ton of work in real estate. And I've done a ton of project management work. So lots of different kinds of communication, lots of different opportunities to figure out what works and what doesn't. That's my particular background. I think I have a pretty decent reputation for being able to tell people no. That is in part because I'm just a contrary person, and that is in part because my first job after college was telling surgeons no a whole lot while being 22 and getting told that I'm their grandchild's age. And if you want a way to learn how to constructively deny somebody what they want, that is a really good way to learn really fast. So I will share with you all of my tips. As with anything that I'm teaching, these are sort of useful thoughts, useful guidelines, hopefully things that'll give you a leg up on figuring out what you want to do and what works for you a little bit faster. None of these are rules. None of these are the one true way. This is mostly just fodder. You should feel free to steal any ideas that work for you, and anything where you're like, that I could never make that work, feel free to throw it away. You're still a good person, I promise. Unless, of course, you weren't a good person in the first place. I have no control over that piece. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and dive in, and we're going to get started. If you have questions, feel free to speak up via microphone or throw that into the chat, and otherwise, we'll just keep going. I am going to warn you while I'm doing slides, I can't see the chat box, so I will be trying to switch between them and check in periodically, but I might not see you right away. I will get to you as soon as I can. It's also probably useful for you to know that I have uploaded the presentation slides to the handouts section of the seminar, so if you want to get a hold of those yourself, go ahead and check for them there. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and dive in. So, how and when to say no. So we kind of already did the introductions. We got this piece taken care of, but if you want to share any extra information, feel free to pop that into the chat, and I will take a look at that to make sure that we address your particular concerns while we're here today. And also, while I know a lot of the people who are in the room right now, I don't think all of you necessarily know each other. So it can be useful to have an idea of what your cohort is and who's going to be sharing some of the same problems that you're having. Sometimes that can be kind of handy for getting just the reassurance that it's not just you. This is, in fact, a pretty common issue that a lot of people deal with. This is the outline for how we're going to broadly be doing things. And then once we cover these categories in the presentation, everybody who is attending live will have a little bit of a workshop, and everybody who is watching via recording, I will show you what we're doing in the workshop, but you're going to kind of have to do that as a self-study. So first thing, boundaries are kind of a very important thing for you to have an idea of that will make it a lot easier for you to say no. One, because it'll tell you when it is that you want to say no, and then two, because it'll help you communicate why it is that you're saying no, and hopefully shut off the potential to have to say no again for reformulations of requests that don't actually address the reason you were saying no in the first place. So this is a moment where I'm going to ask for a little bit of audience feedback. What do you think of generally when you hear the word boundary? What is kind of your response for either what examples for what boundaries are, or if you want to try and throw out a definition for what boundary means to you, or just kind of your visceral response? I hear boundary and all of a sudden I think that, giant fences and cross lines and anything like that. Go ahead and share. I'm going to apologize for my propensity to advance slides when I'm trying to switch windows to see the chat. Evergreen, don't touch me is definitely a boundary that I have great sympathy to and wind up asserting quite a lot. Map lines is a good idea for a boundary. That's definitely a thing. And Lisa brings up an excellent point that sometimes it's harder to say no when a boundary hasn't been crossed. And we're going to talk a little bit about how to conceive of boundaries in a way that'll kind of address that situation coming up. So I'm glad you brought that up. And Alicia, that's a very good concept of boundary. So thank you everybody for participating in the chat, keeping me from just talking to myself at length. So for purposes of this conversation we're having right now, I think it's going to be useful if we think of boundaries as a way that you stay on track. They're as much for you as they are for other people. And I think it's really useful if you take a look when you're thinking about your boundaries and you use two axes for considering them. One of them is the do-don't axis, and the other is the firm fuzzy axis. And I really want to emphasize, these are not the only ways to think of boundaries. These are not the only axes that may be useful to you. You absolutely, if you run into other places that where thinking about them will be useful to you, or if these don't particularly work for you, go ahead and rejigger it. But for this particular conversation right now, this is what I'm going to talk about, are the do-don't axis and the firm fuzzy axis. For the do-don't axis, for like things that you do, a very useful question is to ask yourself, what is it that you do? And that can be have a variety of different facets to it. So the specific types of work that you do, you might say, I am a freelancer. All right, well, that's an extraordinarily broad category. There are tons of things that one can do freelance work in. So maybe you are a freelance editor, for example. All right, even within freelance editing, there is a ton of kinds of work that you can do. And that can be everything from you are a freelance editor of corporate copy, of nonfiction book length work, of academic articles, of grant proposals, of fiction. Within fiction, there can be a variety of things. Perhaps you are a content editor or a line editor or a developmental editor, any number of stuff. You can do a combination of those things. But it's really useful if you know what is it that you do in a way that you can clearly define and articulate both to yourself and to other people. This can also apply to your style and how you approach the work that you do. So if you are an artist, for example, perhaps your style is very linear and stark, and you use very strong contrast between light and dark, and that is the style for which you are known, and people who are looking for that style of work are going to go for that kind of look. Alternatively, you might be somebody who does more of like bright, colorful, very striking, rounded cartoon style work, or maybe you do hyper realistic, heavy digital painting work. Knowing what your style and your approach is will make it easier for you to know whether or not you are a good match with a client. It'll also make it easier for the client to know if you are a good match for them. And that isn't strictly an art thing. That can apply to any number of other things. Even as an editor, you're going to have different styles. There are going to be different things that you focus on. And that's going to be something that clients are going to want to look for in terms of making sure that you are a right match for them. The terms under which you work are also important. That can be things from what is your typical timeline for turnaround? How much input in the process does a client get? How many revisions or revisitings of a deliverable are you willing to do? What kind of communication do you expect on what kinds of timelines? Do you do everything by email? Do you have a form system? How do you do your invoicing? All of those things are the terms under which you work, and having a very clear, this is what I do, again, will make it a lot easier for you to know what to communicate and how to communicate it. And then finally, your process requirements. Figuring out a clear process for how things work and then sticking to it is very useful. So it may be, I'm going to do I will do a sample edit on 2 pages of your thing, or I will do one preliminary sketch for your character proposal, and then we will have a discussion on that, and then based on how we feel about that process, we'll decide whether or not we're going to execute a full contract and go through with the project. Or I require a deposit up front, or I require to have a 15-minute video conversation with you so that I can make sure that you are a reasonable human being who will talk to me like I am a reasonable human being, and that you're not just some random person from the internet. All of these things are process requirements that you will have for different reasons, for your needs and for taking care of your time and your client list, that you want to have a very clear understanding of. And you should really be thinking about all of these process requirements as being boundaries. This is how you work. This is how you function. And that is something that you need to have respected by your clients in order for you to have a productive working relationship with them. This is a slide that just illuminates everything I just rambled about a whole bunch. So I will keep talking here. The reason that you want this is because I mentioned it's going to help you figure out if you match with a client, but it's also going to help you when you're kind of ambiguous about it, when you're like, I don't feel awesome about this, and I'm not really sure why. Having these clear understandings will sort of help you triangulate where some of that feeling of ambiguity might be coming from. And it could be that they're not lining up super well with one of these boundaries. And that could be just a matter of needing to communicate it more clearly and address it. Or it could be that you're actually identifying a mismatch. And there are many, many situations where a mismatch doesn't mean that anybody is unprofessional or that anybody is a bad person. It just means that you're not well suited to have a very productive relationship. And that doesn't have to be a judgment on anyone. That's just a fact. And often everybody is much happier if you recognize that up front before you wind up in a situation where everybody's kind of working against their own nature or against their own needs. The other side of the do-don't axis, of course, is the don't. So what is it that you absolutely don't do? So I do freelance editing, but I am strictly a development and content editor. I don't do line editing. I don't do copy editing. I am a terrible proofreader. And so anything where that level of sort of grammatical comma placement, word choice kind of work, I'm not particularly good at. And the effort it takes for me to make sure that I'm doing a good job at that is going to be significantly more than anything is ever going to compensate me for appropriately. So I just won't take the work. It would be dishonest of me to take work like that when I know I'm not qualified, so I won't do it. That is a hard no. And I have absolutely turned down people who've been like, well, you copy edit my novel, I will pay you a pile of money. And I've been like, that's great. No, I won't. I don't do that. So that's a very useful thing for you to know. And it doesn't have to be because you're not qualified. It doesn't have to be something that's as clear as that. It could just be you don't like doing it. I will no longer project manage EMR installations for hospitals. And it's not because I'm not good at it or I couldn't do it, though I'm 10 years out of date now and I probably wouldn't be good at it anymore. It's because I really don't like working in hospitals. And so I got out of that career and I won't take that work anymore, even when people pitch me for short-term contracts with tons of money. I don't want to do it. So that's an important thing for you to know, and it's an important thing for you to respect. This particular seminar is not really going to talk about burnout much, but part of the reason you want to figure out what your boundaries are and to be protective of them is because for you to be a functional, professional, effective person, you need to take care of yourself. Burnout is in fact, like burning yourself out is in fact unprofessional because it damages your ability to do good work. So know what your boundaries are to protect yourself against burnout so that you can still be a professional person who delivers the quality that you're capable of and that you are promising your clients when you talk with them. Changes in style or approach for how you do things. You can have a range of what you do and work within that range, and you can be willing to sort of work a little bit out of that range, but knowing that, there are just certain extremes of change that you won't do, or certain things that you are outside of what you're going to do that you want to defend. This is something that I'm aware of happens a lot with artists, where they don't necessarily want to do work that's outside of the style that they do their work in, even if they are capable, because it will dilute their brand. And it's time spent fleshing out portfolio that's not going to be useful for them to get the kind of work that they want to be doing for any number of reasons. And so even when it's something that you could do in theory, or maybe that you have done in the past, it may not be something that you want to do because it doesn't serve your long-term trajectory that you're trying to approach. Anything that's an unacceptable or non-negotiable term for a contract. So, pay rates that you just won't even engage with, timelines that are not reasonable for you to do. And that can be both timelines that are too short and ones that are too long. saying, it's perfectly reasonable to say, I don't want to be bogged down with this project for the next 2 years. That's going to take up too much of my bandwidth for too long. I'm looking for things that will be completed in 6 months. I need that kind of flexibility in my planning. Both ends on that are something that you're going to want to think about. And again, it's not that you have to have a lower bound and an upper bound. You decide what makes sense for you, but think about whether or not you might need those things and have it be a choice or a decision that you made in response to your particular needs in your situation. And then changes to process or other accommodations, things that you just absolutely will not do. So I will not take payment by PayPal. I don't have a PayPal account. I don't want a PayPal account. I'm not getting a PayPal account just for you. There are a ton of other ways to pay me. You can mail me a check. You can send me money through Zelle. You can carrier pigeon me packets of tea. I'm pretty flexible on everything other than I don't do PayPal. You might have different things that you will want to do. One that might be really common is you're not giving them your home address. They have to email you at a P.O. box. And it might be a P.O. box that you only check once a week. And that might slow down your interaction for things that happen through mail. And there's just a process that they have to deal with that as a term of working with you. That's totally fine. And in fact, as a freelancer, you might want to consider getting a P.O. box rather than using your home address for things. One of the reasons it's really important to have an explicit "these are the things that I don't do" list is that in the moment when somebody asks you for something that violates your don't boundaries, that thinking is already done for you. So you don't have to think about, is this a thing that I do or is this a thing that I don't do? How do I feel about it? Now that I've done all of that thinking, how do I communicate this to the other person? You're reducing the amount of stuff you have to engage with in that one moment. And with a lot of this, a lot of what you are doing is pre-work so that in the moment, the work that you have to do, the lift that you have to do right then is significantly reduced. And so it makes it much easier for you as a freelancer who's having to juggle all of these extra things beyond just the work to focus on the work and not completely get bogged down in this extra stuff, in the communication, in the decision-making and all of that. So when you have an explicit list for what it is that you don't do, it's really easy if somebody says, hey, will you do this thing, to go, nope, that's on my list. I don't do it. I don't even have to think about it. I know that decision was pre-made for me, and now I'm off the hook in the moment. It also keeps you from kind of gaslighting yourself in a way and going, well, I could do this for like this situation. Yeah, I can do that. And then later being like, why did I say that? I don't do that. That was a terrible idea. And so it makes it a little bit easier for you to like actually take care of yourself in the way that you need to, rather than in the moment giving into your instinct that you want to get the client, you want to get the project, even though actually you probably don't. So a lot of that is a lot of juggling, it's a lot of balancing, and I have provided for you this amusing seesaw on a spring graphic because this is a lot of talking and this is a lot of thinking about things, and I like to break it up. There may or may not be a cat later. I'm not making any promises. Evergreen, I see your question in the chat. I will answer that offsides later. That's not an important thing later. If I don't do it before the seminar is over during the workshop session, go ahead and ping me on Discord. We'll take care of that. So that was do-don't boundaries. Now let's talk about sort of the firm fuzzy axis. And this is for any given boundary, you're going to be thinking about it in terms of, is it a do boundary or a don't thing, or is it a firm thing or a fuzzy thing? Like these aren't, you don't have independent lists for these. This is, a complicated, nuanced way of thinking about stuff. So firm boundaries are the ones that you never or only extremely rarely budge on. So these are going to be things like you cannot turn around a project in less than a certain amount of time. It's just either not physically possible for you or it's not functionally possible for you. Like even if they're paying a huge rush fee, the disaster it would wreak on your life and your working situation would just not be worth it. Things like that. Extreme rates discounts. Anybody who's asking you to work for extraordinarily cheap, you might want to have a firm boundary around that. I, in fact, would strongly encourage you to have a firm boundary around that. protecting your pay rate and making sure that you are in fact earning what you need to earn in order to keep working is something that's really important, and that you should put a lot of thought into exactly how you're constructing your boundaries around that, so that, again, in the moment when you're hungry for work, you don't make decisions that are actually long-term harmful to you. Types of work that you're not qualified for, and this can be really complicated. Often as a freelancer, you're an expert in the work that you do, and the people who are asking you to do the work are not. And so they may not understand why trying to hire you for task A doesn't work when you do task B. Aren't A and B kind of the same or next to each other? And so it's really useful if you have a clear understanding of, how far outside of your particular wheelhouse are you both willing and able to go. So I already gave the example of I don't do any copy editing. I don't do I'm very firm. I don't take anything where you're looking at kind of line level, word level edits, because even to the extent where I might say, hey, I can actually punch up your rhythm. I can punch you up for being better at audio or for being better at spoken prose than you might be for written prose. Like, that is actually a thing that I can do. I have done a lot of work in speech writing and whatnot, but I will not take editing work focused on that because it gets too fuzzy, and there's too much like upfront thinking about what exactly is it that they want. It's not worth it for me to fully qualify the client to make sure that they're going to be happy with what I can do. So that's kind of that's a very firm boundary for me, even though my actual skill set's a little bit fuzzier than I present it as. So that's going to be something that you will know personally about you. You absolutely should have any work that you're straight up not qualified for be a firm boundary. Anything where you're taking the work for the experience, the learning opportunity, I would strongly encourage you to think of as being separate from work that you are taking kind of as part of your core business, and to assess it in terms of its potential to teach you a skill and deliver a skill to you, rather than are you taking this as a client as part of your larger business. That can get fuzzy for you if it's 80% of this project is in my wheelhouse and 20% of it will be a learning opportunity for me. Like, things are not clean and clear cut in a way that's really easy for you to separate them in that fashion. But I do strongly encourage you to try and think of those, kind of have separate rubrics you go down in your head for assessing opportunities, so that you're not getting things kind of intermixed in a way that will lead you to making, again, bad decisions that'll either lead to making you unhappy or making the client unhappy or just making everybody unhappy. Nobody likes it when in a situation where all parties aren't happy and content at the end. So try to avoid that a little bit. Fuzzy boundaries, and we talked about this a little bit while talking about the last slide. Those are ones where there is give on them, where you can go ahead and it's not how you prefer to do it, or it's not how an ideal world works, but you can go ahead and shift it, and it's not that big of a deal. So reducing timelines for urgency to something that you can still do but is faster than what you would normally do, especially if they're paying you more in exchange for that, that's a fuzzy boundary. So maybe you have a 6-week turnaround as your normal default, but you'll do it in a month if it's a particularly good client or a particularly well-paying job. Discounts on your rate for a good cause, where you define good cause. That might be something that you have a fuzzy range on. So I will give a 20% discount to friends and family, or people who've been referred by my clients, or for charitable work or whatnot. But I won't give an 80% discount. So the 80% discount would be the hard boundary, but that would be a firm boundary. But the 20% discount would sort of be in your fuzzy range. Like, that's something to think about for that. And then also for work that you don't like to do, and that you don't want to sort of be putting yourself out as a person who does, but that you're willing to take, and that isn't going to sort of actively harm the trajectory for your business and for your career that you're trying to develop. So, I primarily edit science fiction, fantasy, romance. I'm willing to edit other genres depending on the needs of the client. I don't seek it out. That's slightly outside of my core competency. It's slightly outside of the genres I am most up to date on. And so to make sure that I'm editing with the contemporary expectations of the audience in mind, I'd have to do a little bit more legwork on it. But, I potentially, for the right client, for the right situation, especially if it's an existing client who's branching out and, they're taking on a new genre, but we have a good working history, I might be willing to do that. One, to keep them from wandering off to somebody else. And then two, because, sometimes paying it back to a client who's been good to you is really worth it. And they'll recognize that you did that and keep that relationship preserved. So that's a fuzzy boundary. Here is my list of boundaries I suggest that you have, particularly related to pay. While you are in training, while you are starting up a new career, while you're trying to get your skill set in place, I would strongly encourage you to avoid working for free. And I mean working for free. So work that you're doing for a class assignment or as part of a training program that kind of has, an established protocol to it, or that you're doing kind of as part of an apprenticeship. I wouldn't necessarily consider that working for free. There's a structure, there are clear deliverables that you've agreed to walking into it. There are boundaries built into that process generally, where it's only a certain amount of work on a certain amount of timeline. And you're not going to get yourself in a situation where you get used to doing work for free that looks very much like doing your actual job. And then you don't know when to flip that switch and start pushing back and being like, actually, I don't work for free anymore. Like, that's where a lot of freelancers get into trouble. And so I kind of strongly encourage you to avoid doing that. I don't think it's like that's going to have to be, in a lot of cases, a little bit of a fuzzy boundary, because that is just the nature of the world. So I'm not saying that, like, you're absolutely doing a wrong thing if while you're training you do work for free. But it's something that I would strongly encourage you to be very skeptical of and very thoughtful about when you do it. And sort of address it as is this me being willing? Am I willing to bend this boundary under these circumstances, rather than approaching it as well, of course, this is a thing that I do. Kind of start off from that. I do, however, once you're getting established, once you're not training anymore, you're building your client list, you're getting your business going, encourage you to switch that to being a firm boundary and just say, I'm sorry, I can't take on work for free at this time. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One, you are in the middle of a hustle. You're spending a lot of time looking for work rather than doing the work. So you just don't have the time to be working for free, because anytime that you're not doing paid work, you need to be looking for paid work and getting your feet under you. And so you're really kind of not doing yourself a favor when you take on working for free. The other reason is that you are so close to that training phase that there's a great risk both that you will perceive yourself as taking that working for free just because you aren't yet worth, or you have not yet earned being paid for your work. And there's also a risk that is the impression you will be giving clients and other people, is that, oh, this person's not sufficiently established to really be worth paying. And so I really strongly encourage you to put a big buffer between that and go, no, I have crossed the line. I'm not in training anymore. I am now a professional and I expect to be paid. And really avoid anything that's going to kind of muddy the waters on that and make it easy for you to kind of feel wishy-washy on that. Which is why once you're established and you do have your client base under you and you're not doing like starting from ground zero hustle looking for clients and building your list, then you can start taking a look at working for extreme discounts or working for free. But I encourage you to have an articulated list of the circumstances under which you will work for free. So don't just do it willy-nilly, but maybe you do it for friends as a favor, or you do it for causes that you care about. And maybe depending on how many causes you care about, you will only do it for certain causes you care about. So maybe this year is the year where you do it for housing vulnerability related issues. And next year will be the year that you do it for vulnerable youth related issues. And the year after that is your year of doing it for whatever that cause, animal shelters or whatnot. But having something that will kind of stop you from talking yourself out of doing paid work. And you should have a pretty good sense of how much you have to wrangle yourself on that. Some people are very good about that and being like, no, I can only spend 10% of my working hours working for free. And I am happy to do that as, a good citizen of society and to give back in that way. But more than that, I really can't afford. I need that to be paying work. however that is going to make most sense for you, go ahead and do that. But I do strongly encourage you to have kind of sat down and have that list of what are the circumstances under which you work for free. Once you are established, and it's not going to lead to either you or clients getting confused about whether or not you are a professional who commands a professional rate. Which ties into this next point about opportunity cost. Are people in general, if I say opportunity cost, familiar with that term, or is this the first time that a lot of people are hearing it? So we've got a little bit in the chat saying people are familiar with it. Yeah, okay. So it looks like we have some familiarity with this. So I'm not going to start at like the total ground zero. I'm one of the reasons I'm very glad that board games have gotten popular is not just because I really enjoy board games, but because it makes it a lot easier to talk about a lot of these things because people sort of understand trade-offs and decision making a lot more fluently from board game experience than they happen in a lot of other times when they are not board game players. So thanks. Resource management games. Opportunity cost is one of the reasons that I want you, when you're thinking about boundaries, to really kind of think about it in terms of your boundaries. This is a reason you're going to want to stick to what you have established is what you do and don't do, and kind of respect. Yes, this is a fuzzy boundary. It's still a boundary. Just because it's fuzzy doesn't mean that I'm always going to go ahead and step across that line. It's really, really easy, especially if you're early in your career or if you're hitting a rough patch in your career where, I don't know, there's a global pandemic and everything's in upheaval and things that you were counting on aren't falling out the way you were expecting. I don't know who might be experiencing that, but anything like that, it's really tempting to say, you know what, I just need to be working. I need to take any work I can get. I will do it, whatever it is. I have bills to pay. I want to keep, I want to keep the shop going. I want to keep everything running. That's very normal. That's very understandable. But it's actually a very dangerous way for you to approach potential opportunities for work. You need to keep in mind that anything that you say yes to is intrinsically a no to whatever you would have been doing instead. And while it might be paying work that you have in hand, is it coming at the expense of you pursuing paying work that is the work that you actually want to do? So if you are trying to set up a freelance consulting, like game design business, if you're spending all of your time working at the coffee shop because you panicked and took the first job you could find, you're not going to be looking for clients to do your game development consulting with because you're going to be serving cups of coffee. And as somebody who has definitely said, I need a break, I'm going to go work at a coffee shop for a while until I figure out the next thing that I want to do, there's nothing wrong with taking the coffee shop job as long as you did it on purpose and you know why you're doing it and it's not coming at the expense of the work that you want to be doing. That's a totally valid thing for you to do as long as it is the choice that you're making for the right reasons. So if your actual goal is to be pursuing a particular kind of business, any opportunities you say yes to that are not in service to developing that business, are you choosing not to develop that business, not to pursue it, to take time away from it? And a lot of those situations where you're tempted to take the work no matter what because you want the money or you need the payment or you need the client or you're afraid of losing the relationship, you're not doing yourself any favors by ignoring that aspect of what you're doing. So it's very important for you to ask yourself, what is the cost of saying yes in this situation? And not strictly looking at it in terms of time and materials, but taking a look at what would you have been doing with that time? What would you have been doing with those materials? What are you giving up by saying yes in that moment? That said, don't starve. If it really is the case that if you don't take the job at the coffee shop, even though it's taking time away from the business you want to be doing, you're going to lose your house. If you don't, you also can't pursue your business if you are unhoused and having to deal with that. So there's always going to be a trade-off on that. And I am not telling you that it is your duty to starve or like become financially destitute in order to focus on your actual goals. preserving yourself and your circumstances is something that is in service to your actual goals. So don't turn down all work that comes your way just because it's not the work that you want to be doing because somebody told you that it was an opportunity cost and that you couldn't do it that way. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that when assessing it, don't ignore this aspect of it. And if you really are in a situation where it's like, look, I take this client, I take this job, or I won't be around for the job that I want when it comes by, then, you have considered the opportunity cost. And the answer is that the opportunity cost is not too high for you to take that work. So this is a metric for best allotting your time to serve your goals. This is not, an exhortation to follow your dreams at all costs. I am not a follow your dreams at all costs kind of person. I'm much more pragmatic than that. My advice will always be, how do you pragmatically follow your dreams without completely shooting your foot off in the process? So that said, it's really, really important for you to internalize and understand that it is always okay for you to say no to work that you don't want. It is always okay for you to say no to working conditions you don't want. Anytime that you are courteously and professionally asserting a boundary, it does not matter what the boundary is. It doesn't matter if you are the only person in the world with that particular boundary. It is okay for you to have made that assertion. Nobody else is entitled to your time and your expertise and your work under circumstances where you do not want to offer it. That is fundamentally a thing that is shockingly hard for people to kind of internalize and get, because there's this inclination to feel like you are obligated to be working and that people who give you the opportunity to work are doing you a favor. You are doing them a favor by completing their work. And so you may not be the person to complete it under the circumstances under which they need it completed, but that is okay. You are not required to be the person who can complete the work under the terms that they need. So just take a minute and sit down with that. If you need somebody with an authoritative voice to tell you that, this is being recorded. You can play back this portion of the video anytime you want. I am telling you that is valid and okay. And again, taking care of yourself and protecting your ability to function is the most professional thing that you can do, because it ensures you can do your best work for the clients you do take. So that is not even you being unprofessional. It is absolutely you doing what you need to do in order to fulfill your obligations to the best of your ability. This is really important for you to think about if you're having a situation where you're noticing you kind of have a case of the don't wannas. There's been a lot of the don't wannas going around in this last year for reasons of stress and exhaustion, and that's very valid. And so when you're having them, the first question when you're noticing that is just ask yourself, are you burned out? And you could very easily be burned out, not because you've been working too much, but because life is very exhausting right now, and that puts everybody at extraordinary risk for burnout. But the other question might be, if you're looking at a prospect, if somebody has approached you with a job and you're looking at it and you're like, the thought of following through with this fills me with like exhaustion and despair, and I don't want to, and I don't understand why. If you've thought about it and you're like, it's not that I'm burned out. In general, I don't have this response. I'm getting the dishes done. I get out of bed. Like, putting on clothes is not a challenge. I'm not showing any other symptoms of burnout. It's really just when I think about this particular thing. Then in that situation, there might be an opportunity cost you're not accounting for. What is it that looking at that is kind of dredging up? Is it something that isn't, advancing your goals? Maybe you need to rethink what your goals are if it looks like it is. Like, examine it from that angle. And a lot of times when it's not burnout, thinking about it in terms of opportunity cost will sort of shake loose why it's not fitting for you. We will pause here for reasons of lion cub. So, speaking of preventing burnout, Just gaze at those fuzzy faces. Yeah. It is the pause. Thank you for catching that. I knew I could count on you. All right. Maybe just check it on the chat a little bit. Lisa, that is an excellent thing for you to have brought up, and we can talk about that later on, and particularly during the workshop section of things. So if we don't circle back to that for you, go ahead and bring it up again, but I've got you on my radar. So we'll talk about Lisa's question about kind of how to say no to people you owe a favor when they ask that favor. So we're transitioning into a slightly different section of the presentation here where we're going to start talking about actual communication. So everything we've talked about up to this point is about helping you figure out what you're communicating, kind of giving you a groundwork so that you know yourself in a situation where communication has to happen, so that you don't have to do the self-figuring out in the moment on the spot when the communication is expected of you. Going forward here with the presentation, we're going to be talking a little bit more about now that, like, how do we control the communication in the moment, and sort of we're circling in on that actual expectation for you to give a response. We're going to start with passive communication, which is not necessarily you're expected to give a response right at the moment, but kind of all of the ways in which you share information or set expectations without explicitly talking to a person in any fashion. So these are all of the things that people are coming to before you ever have an opened interactive conversation. So the setup on your website, what your business cards look like, the blurb on your book, all of those things that kind of share a little bit of your personality, share a little bit of your style, your public bio, your LinkedIn page, all of those things are what we're kind of talking about when we're talking about passive communication. So these are the things that are anybody who's thinking about opening a conversation with you or approaching you as a potential freelancer are going to see and might, be the reason that they are inquiring about getting you to work for them. Given that, it's really important that all of these things that you have out there are telling people the things that you want them to hear. So, if you are that artist who has the very stark angular style, but your website is full of very round, cartoony, chibi drawings, it's not going to be startling if people come to you for things that match your website style rather than the kind of work that you want to be doing. And I just chose an extremely obvious and simple example, but that applies to a lot of different aspects of, depending on what your freelancing is. Like, it's a broad thing. So pause for a moment. Let's just do a little bit of interactivity, because now that you had the respite with the lion cubs, it's time to participate a little. What are some examples of passive communication that you're familiar with? Either things that you have done and are aware kind of got out to other people, or things that you have seen as the person kind of doing the approaching, where you realize that you've had a lot of expectations set through things that were not the direct conversation. So somebody has mentioned the panels you choose at cons. That does definitely communicate a lot about, when you choose to speak, where you're speaking publicly. Definitely making sure that your public appearances are ones that play into what you want people thinking of for you. So the example in the chat is turning down diversity panels and instead asking for science panels, so that people then perceive you as a person who is knowledgeable about science. That is actually a very important one. That's a good one to think about, because people are going to ask you to speak about the things that they have heard you speaking about. So it's not going to occur to them to ask you to speak about things that they're not aware that you speak about. And so the best way to make sure people are aware that you speak about something is to have spoken about it. So that's definitely a really good element of passive communication. Any other examples in the chat that want to pop up? All right, I am not seeing much. We'll go ahead. If you think of something, go ahead and drop it into the chat. I'm just going to click back to the presentation so I won't see it immediately. All right. So passive communication is something that I actually encourage you to be very thoughtful about and to be very kind of deliberately selective and choosy and almost manipulative about and what you're doing. How much you want to explicitly state about what your boundaries are and how you want to phrase those is going to depend a lot on both you and the kind of work that you're doing. But even if it's the kind of situation where you don't really think it's in your interests to do a lot of I do this, I don't do that in your communicating, it's still a really good idea to make sure that what you do put out there is aligned with your underlying things. So for my editing, I have my rate sheet up. I'm very explicit about I do this, I don't do that. Part of that is because it's a very small aspect of like all of the things that I do. I do very little. I take 1 or 2 editing clients a year at this point. And so I don't really want to be spending a lot of time fielding inquiries that are not good fits for me. I don't really want to do a lot of having to educate the client about who I am as an editor and what working with me is going to be like. I just put it all out there so that they can see it. And if they go, this is not a good fit for me, they can wander away and I never have to deal with it. And so part of my passive communication is I don't want to spend a lot of time on this part of my career. This is not a huge priority for me. It is a thing that I do to kind of keep myself sharp and because it's fun to do a little bit, but it's not a central goal of how I'm spending my life. And so a lot of my passive communication is very direct. And the subtext to all of it is, if you're not going to read all of this and then decide whether or not we're a good fit before approaching me, I probably don't want to work with you because I just don't have time to do that level of communication and education for you as my client. That's not true for everyone. There are plenty of people where especially if that is your primary focus in your freelancing, you want anybody talking to you possible. You can spend the time getting them up to speed about what it is that you do and don't do. And you're probably a lot less picky about exactly what kind of client you're willing to take. And so being very narrow in your prescription and kind of putting up that barrier and that resistance to anybody approaching you as a client is not going to be in your interests. You want to be very easy to approach. And so it may just be, here are my awesome clients. Here is my mission statement about how I work. Here's the form where you can contact me. Please let me start talking to you so I can lure you in as my client. And that is something that is very clearly communicating what your priorities and your goals are. And so you want to be doing that. So this is one of those situations where it's useful to see what other people who do the same kind of work that you're doing, to see what they do so that you have ideas for what your options are. But just because somebody is very much in the same space as you, and perhaps even just because their career is one that you very much want yours to look like, does not mean that what they are doing is the thing that you want to be doing. So you're going to want to take a look at that and just, instead of saying, oh, should I be on these social media sites doing this schedule of promotion the way that they are, ask yourself, what are they getting out of doing that? Why are they doing it that way? And then, do I have those same goals? Am I looking for those same things? Or do I want to be doing something slightly different? How does that inform the choices that I'm making about how I do my communication? So, for example, another thing that you can do is don't talk about how quick you are at turning things around if you're not taking rush jobs right now. Maybe you did a lot of taking rush jobs earlier in your career, and now you're at, no, really, my client list is so full, I'm doing so much work, I need 2 months for turnaround, and anything less is just not, I can't. In that situation, you probably don't want to be presenting yourself as somebody who's doing quick turnarounds as the thing that you are leading with on your website and on your descriptions about yourself. Even if it's true that you're fairly quick, that's not what you're going to want to emphasize, because that's where people are going to lean into it. So instead, maybe talk about how good you are at meeting deadlines and how consistently you finish your work within expectations. And like, there are other ways to talk about that same element that aren't going to be setting an expectation that you don't particularly want to have be their primary interest in you. And so you can control that perception a little bit just in terms of how you frame that particular skill set that you have. It's also a really good idea just not to mention anything about work that you aren't doing anymore or that you're trying to do less of. Because even if it's work that you have done that shows that you're qualified and that you have a long history and an established career, it can make the actual communication much harder. So at this point, for example, my resume may have a line about hospital EMR installations on it, but it doesn't really go into a lot of depth because that is not the work that I want to be doing. And so I want to, I have it in there so you don't see a gap in my resume and wonder what I was doing immediately after college. But beyond that, I'm not going into a lot of details because it has very little to do with the kind of work that I'm doing now. And so instead, I have tons of things that I'm doing much more recently that have many, many lines on my resume. And that's the conversation that I want to be having. And so that's what's at top. And that's what gets all of the space. And that's how I'm controlling that particular conversation. I don't want you to ask me questions about where the answers are going to be, actually, I really hate being in hospitals. And after 3 years of telling surgeons no all the time, I got tired of it and cranky and just, decided to throw that career in the garbage bin and go off and do absolutely anything else. That's not a great conversation to be having. It's very negative. Instead, let's talk about the really cool stuff I've been doing lately that I'm very enthusiastic about that I want to be doing more of. I look like a much more pleasant, competent, excited, engaged person when that's the conversation we're having instead. And so it's really important that that's what I lead with and that's what people see. Anytime you have something posted publicly, you're doing yourself a favor because you can then use all of those elements of passive communication, those things that you have posted, to make it easier for you to reaffirm that in the actual direct communication. So this is very useful. It may not be in your interests to post your rate sheet, depending on what your rates are, depending on how flexible they are, especially if you are early on in your career where you are perhaps willing to work for extraordinarily cheap, but an established professional could command a much higher rate. You might not want to post your rate sheet because either it could turn off, you either post very high rates that might turn off people who would take you at a lower rate, but they weren't even going to ask, or it may just sort of establish you as being somebody who works for cheap. And so that might be a situation where you don't post your rate sheet. But I would encourage you to sort of sit down and think really hard about whether or not you ought to post your rate sheet. And I would encourage you to actually post the rate sheet that has the higher rates. That's going to scare people off less often than you think. And it makes it a lot easier when somebody approaches you with a lowball offer to go, well, as my rate sheet shows. And the thing that's useful for that, that's useful for a number of reasons. One, because for you in the moment, it doesn't feel necessarily the same as just telling somebody, give me more money. Because what you're doing is you're making an appeal to authority. There's this external source that you are citing as the reason that you're not just capitulating to the thing that they have approached you with. That external source is you. It's past you posting a thing on your website, but it's not giving in the moment you, who is wanting to have this conversation and really wants this job, also the burden of saying no to somebody you very much want to say yes to. So it makes that a little bit easier for you, but also it makes it easier on the potential client side because they're not hearing you in the moment say no. They're hearing an external authority who is established and who was there before they approached you say, actually, these are the circumstances that need to happen. And again, it's still just you. It's past you. but it makes that feel less like a direct confrontation or a direct rejection. And so it gives you this extra tool to make that communication a little bit smoother. And so you're already kind of helping yourself out in the moment by having this external authority that you can cite, even though the external authority is just you. I'm sure we've all heard stories about people saying, I'm very interested in that, but you're going to have to talk to my agent. Here's their email address. And the agent with the email address is just the same person with a fake, or my manager or whatever. It's just the same person using a different name, being the hard ass and establishing the boundaries and doing the hard negotiating that the individual wants to do, but it's easier for the client to hear it coming from this person whose job is to be the person who asserts all of those boundaries. And so this is a little bit of you doing that without having to set up a fake identity and create a fictional person in order to do that for you. And so this is kind of a way that you can create that external authority somewhat less fraudulently. I strongly encourage you to post an FAQ page and update it regularly, and just be extremely aggressive about dropping that. Like, you can make it your email signature even. Having that FAQ is really useful, not just in a why are you asking me these questions that I answer explicitly on my website sort of way, but in a establishing that this is normal. It normalizes the things that you are communicating. It makes it feel like that this is not a negotiable or a fuzzy thing. And that it also, for the client, sort of establishes a normalization for them having these questions. And so it's okay that the client doesn't know how this process works. Other people have asked it because it's a frequently asked question, right? And it potentially reduces the overhead on communication that you have to do, because if they do actually go through and read your FAQ and they do actually internalize the information from that, and those are two things that don't happen as often as you would like. But if they do go ahead and do that, that's one less client you have to, manually educate on all of that. And then also, that they are the kind of person who, when you suggest they go read an FAQ, does go read the FAQ and internalizes it. And that is a client you probably want to retain and work with a whole bunch. And maybe you automatically give them a rate discount just because they're not going to be as much overhead for you to interact with as somebody who requires you to explicitly lay it out for them individually every time. So that's a really useful passive communication tool that you can establish and have on hand, and then use both for client vetting and for just making it clear what's normal and what's expected in a very non-judgmental way. And anytime you can sort of establish what I am doing is normal and accepted and okay, and you are not a bad person for not having known that or for having asked about it, is a really good way to constructively communicate while also kind of saying no to a whole lot of things that may not have even been asked yet, but would otherwise potentially come up for you. That said, you can have the world's most perfect, thoroughly consistent, precisely honed passive communication machine surrounding you, and you're still going to get people who are completely oblivious to it and come to you out of nowhere without any awareness that you have ever said anything about what it is that you do, and are immediately going to show up and be like, how about you violate this hard boundary that you have for me, because I am awesome and you need me. That tells you something about that client. And that tells you something that you are probably very happy to know about that client before you start working with them. I am not saying that means you don't work with that client and that you tell them to take a hike and leave you alone, because your circumstances may not be ones in that moment where that is a thing that you are comfortable doing or that is in your long-term best interests. But even if you are taking on a client who is clearly a bad idea, who is clearly going to be a pain to work with and require a lot of hand-holding and be very frustrating, like, there are times where you just cannot decide not to work with somebody just because they're obnoxious or because they're hard to deal with. It's still useful to be aware of that going in, so that you know to block out here's my client call, and then here's the venting conversation I have with my bestie about the client call. And then here is where I throw things for half an hour and drink a pot of tea. And then here is where I get to work for the client and do the things that we talked about in that client call. And just knowing that that's how you're going to have to schedule your day can do a whole lot to make dealing with that bad client less destructive to you as a human and a professional than it would be otherwise. So again, this is one of those ways passive communication can be useful, because when it totally doesn't work and you are sure that you have it all in line, it then gives you information about the people who are approaching you. And it's not a hard and fast thing. We had the example earlier about changing the panels that you appear on at conventions. If the person who's approaching you has never interacted with conventions at all, that is passive communication that will have gone completely past them. And it doesn't mean anything that they don't have any of the awareness that they would have gotten from being in that convention space. And so that's something that you're going to want to be aware of. But if somebody says, I found you on your website, I'm now asking for something that is clearly stated on that website that you don't do, then you know either that they didn't find you on the website, or that they used a bot that was scraping things, or that they don't particularly listen, or that they think it's okay to ask people for things that they explicitly say that they don't do. And now you know something. And what you do with that will be up to you, but knowing it is useful, and you've put yourself in a situation to get that information. So that completes the passive communication portion of this. I'm going to check in the chat real quick before we get into responses. And there has not been much in the chat, so we will go ahead and proceed from here. So this is non-exhaustive. I don't think this is even all of my tips and tricks, but we didn't have 2 years to go through this. But these are sort of top things that I think will be useful. When making a response, answer the main question first, even if there were lots of questions in there. Just sort of, and even if the main question was buried in there, like there'll be people who like, do I answer their last question first? Do I answer them the questions in the order that they asked them in? Pick whichever the main one is and answer that one first, as close to the top of your email as possible, because that's the thing that they are most likely to actually read. And so you want to address the main thing as directly and immediately as you possibly can. So if they are approaching you for a project, opening with, yes, I can do that project, is going to serve you a lot better than if they first started, hey, are you in fact the person I had the conversation with 2 years ago in the hallway of this place? And do you remember what the particular tea that you recommended to me at that time was? And who was that book we were talking about? And oh, by the way, can I hire you for this thing? And also, do you have the contact information for the person we bumped into later? Like, address the main thing first. Formatting is your friend. The formatting on this slide, I am realizing, is terrible. So do as I say, not as I do, with apologies for that. Feel free to, if they've buried a ton of questions that you need to address throughout their email, just respond in a list. Just go ahead and do bullet points or number it or letter it or whatever is appropriate for the circumstances and matches your style, and go for that. And then hopefully they can respond in turn also in a list, and it's a little bit easier to follow the conversation thread that way. Similarly, feel free to bold important details. Whatever, like, keep in mind that depending on how fancy your formatting gets, it may not translate to all email providers or all clients or whatnot, but go ahead and just do some basic things to help you organize and control the conversation flow. Be very judicious about any ambiguity that you're leaving. So any kinds of, like, if at all possible, make things clear, concise statements or explicit, straightforward questions, and avoid things that are like not clear which one of those things they are. It's very tempting to add some ambiguity in because it feels polite. it feels like you're not being assertive. You're being a little bit fuzzy and soft and approachable or whatnot. But particularly with written communication, what it does is it lets somebody who's reading something quickly on their phone while they're dealing with all of the things of life to completely miss that there's something that needs to be addressed. And so I'm just going to go ahead and say it is perfectly professional to be straightforward, clear cut, and precise about how you're communicating and the choices that you make there. It's not to say that you should never be ambiguous. There are definitely times where that can be useful, where you want to leave things vague or just sort of invite whatever fuzzy response they might decide to respond. But make that be something that you're doing as a deliberate choice rather than as your default communication style. And I say this being a Southerner, where couching everything 4 layers deep and there's a knife buried at the bottom of it is my native dialect of communication. It's sometimes really useful just to explicitly say whatever the thing is. And it can be hard sometimes to realize that you're not explicitly saying whatever the thing is, depending on what your natural style is. So that's something to pay attention to. And don't, if you know that you fall into a particular kind of communication style or norm that isn't universally applicable, don't ask somebody who also defaults to that same communication style and norm whether or not you have overcome that tendency. Perhaps ask somebody who is not familiar with it, and they can then tell you, no, as a person who does not speak Southern, I don't understand what you're trying to get at here. That's going to be a little bit more useful for you. Go ahead and be really, really blunt about emphasizing any critical questions or follow-ups. Bolding is your friend. Underlining is your friend. Italics is a little bit a little bit easy to miss sometimes, but bold and underline are really good. One thing to keep in mind, doubling up, bolding and underlining, or italicizing and bolding. Doubling up can still work. Doing all 3 at once, there's actually research that demonstrates that people just blank out on whatever it is and don't process it at all, and you have rendered it invisible by emphasizing it too much. So you could even go so far as to make a little style sheet for yourself about, what it is you're communicating by bolding something versus underlining it versus italicizing it. And this is not there's a correct way to deploy emphasis kind of thing. But if you create a little style sheet for yourself, depending on how you communicate and how you draft things and what feels good for you, it may make it easier for you to kind of scan over something before you send it and be like, okay, this is where I should add a bold, or this is where I should add an underline, and feel like you are in control of those choices rather than willy-nilly, haphazardly throwing them in. And so that may also not be a good choice for you, depending on who you are as a person and what your style is. But think about that and go ahead and just be extremely, extremely willing to very cheaply go, I'm just bolding this because it matters, and not try and get it buried in word choice or paragraph breaks or whatnot. Just go for the obvious thing. Go ahead and this can be a little tricky depending on your time and your bandwidth and your read on other people and how much of like as a soft skill you have for this. But there are certain things that you can do even if you're not particularly skilled in this area in terms of matching their style. So if they are somebody who you just know from having a history of communicating with them that they never read past the first sentence of an email, it's probably not super worth your while to put anything important in any of the subsequent sentences of that email. And you should, in fact, ask yourself whether it's worth having more than one sentence in your email if you know they're only going to read past the first one. So maybe what you do is you send them 5 emails over the course of 3 hours that are all one sentence long. And that's going to be what it takes to communicate with them effectively. There are going to be other people where they need all the information in one place and they're going to look back at it later. And so you want to write them a very long, well-ordered email that has everything in it, and it's going to be worth spending a little bit more time on it because they're going to come back to it. But if you split it out across follow-ups or whatnot, they're going to lose the information and then they'll never know it. It's the same as if you didn't tell them. Keep that in mind and then go ahead and write them the lengthier email. So feel free to do that. And when we get into scripting, there will be templates for like rough things. You're not necessarily going to have a template that matches every particular style, but that is the thing that you'll want to keep in mind. Maybe this is somebody where you don't use your regular templates, but you do something else that's going to work a little bit better for them. The trick with that is going to be, you want that to be a minority of the communication you do rather than the majority of it. So script is default and then personalized for rare things, just as with story subs or any number of other situations. And then my last point for this, it is always professional for you to be firm but kind. Anybody who says that, anything else, basically, they're just wrong. If you are firm but kind, that is always professional. So the whole thing with the customer always being right, I think it is understood that that's actually not true. But just because the customer is wrong, or just because the client is off base, or you were not the person they should have talked to, you don't have to rub it in. You are not required to rub it in. Depending on the situation, it may not be a problem if you do. But it's perfectly fine to always just go, no, I'm not the right person for you to approach for this. Have a nice day. And you haven't helped them any, and you haven't really gone out of your way for them. And that's okay. You didn't have to. You weren't required to. That's enough from you. So anybody who complains about that is just whining. I hope everybody gets the spoonful of sugar reference here. If you didn't get it, I have now laid it out for you. There's a spoonful of sugar as a picture to break this up. And this is something that I want to super emphasize for you. If you are communicating professionally and a potential client or even an existing client reacts poorly to that, that is not your fault. Even if you were telling them something they did not want to hear, something that you know they did not want to hear, they are responsible for controlling their reaction. Like, they can go throw things and shout all they want when you're not in the room and you can't hear it. Their reply back to you by email had better be also professional. You don't want to work with people who are not going to be respectful and professional with you. And it is not your fault if a client of yours turns out not to meet that standard. It is not your responsibility to drag them kicking and screaming into behaving like a professional adult. Again, as freelancers, you don't always have the luxury or the privilege or even like the basic fundamental ability to decide not to work with somebody who is a jerk or who is flagrantly unprofessional. You could be in a situation where you're like, look, they're a horrible human being to interact with. They're vicious and destructive and malicious, but they pay well and they pay on time. And that may be a situation that you just kind of have to suck up and you don't have a choice about. I would encourage you to find ways to flesh out your client base so that you do wind up in a situation where you can stop working with them. It is also always okay to kind of tap your colleagues on the shoulder and be like, look, this guy pays well, but don't work with them if you have, any other way to do it. They're a jerk. That's also perfectly appropriate. Excuse me, sorry. But this is something that I think, particularly given that sometimes as a freelancer, you have to just take work from people who really don't deserve to get to work with other people. It can be hard, and it's really normal to decide that if you're in that situation, you are somehow responsible for it, because it feels that sort of need to feel like you have control over something, but it's not your fault if that's what's going on. And you are not a bad person if you are trying to control or constrain the extent to which that affects your life outside of the moment. And it is okay to be upset if somebody treats you that way. So just saying that really explicitly, because that's a thing that especially if you're starting out and you don't have a lot of experience, it happens. It's not okay when it happens, and it's not your fault. Moving on to less depressing things. Something that can be useful for you when you're making a response is going the extra mile. And this is not a thing that is required, but it's a tip to think about. If you can't help somebody with a problem that they are bringing to you, or you're not the right person for them, especially in situations where you would really like to work with them, or they're really cool, say some publisher approaches you and wants to commission you for something that is just not what you do. But it's a publisher that's like the dream publisher that you would love to be commissioned for. You would really love to appear in their product or work on their IP. This is an opportunity to, try and keep that door open, even if you can't walk through it right now. And so pointing them to resources, referring somebody else, doing something that kind of adds value to them having approached you, even though the thing that they approached you about you can't help them with, is something that you might want to do. This is not a requirement, but it's a way to kind of soothe over the pain of having to turn down something that you wish would work. In terms of referring business to a colleague, this is one situation where networking with other people who work in related spaces or in your space, and just knowing people who are good at their job and perhaps do slightly different work from you is really valuable, because then hey, I only do content development editing. I don't do line editing. Lots of people approach me for it, and I can say, hey, I don't do that, but I know this person over here who does. And I think this is actually the example. Yes, it is. The example I have on this next slide here. I don't do that particular kind of work, but I know somebody who does, who I think would be a really good fit for you. I can go ahead and recommend you to them. And I know that person knows that while they are primarily a line editor, I do a lot of development editing. So if they get a manuscript where somebody's asking them for a line edit, where they go, your plot doesn't work and your characters are, need some enhancement, I have this friend who does excellent work in that area. I think you should go talk to her. And then you get a little bit of that paying it forward going around. It's not a tit for tat. You don't keep track of how many people you've referred to anyone, particularly because referrals often don't actually pan out. That connection doesn't wind up happening. But it's a way that you keep the conversation with the potential client open. It's a way that you show that you're a generally helpful person, and somebody who they might want to work with someday when things do line up. In real estate, I definitely got a lot of business out of people who I had turned down for business. It was like, I'm not the right fit for you. Here are the reasons I'm not the right fit for you. Let me educate you on this a little bit. Here are the kinds of places you should go. And they went and told their friends, hey, you're doing this thing that she does. You should go talk to her. She knew a ton of stuff, even though it wasn't her area. Like, she got me set up. And so that's just kind of a broadly useful thing to do. Again, this is going above and beyond. It is optional, but it can also, when you're in a situation where you kind of don't want to just shut a thing down, give you a way to feel better about the interaction too. That said, have some priorities. Preserve yourself. Don't waste your time on an obvious waste of time. If somebody just cold contacts you off of your website for something that is clearly not anything like what you do, and they're asking you to work for cheap or free or whatever, or they're showing up with, the attitude that it will be your personal privilege to give them whatever they want, you don't even have to answer. There's a spam folder for a reason. Even if they're not technically spam, if they're just, some humans are human spam, okay? You're under no obligation to respond to things that, even if the person totally would have talked to you if you responded, were not actually good faith approaches. Feel free to just not waste your time and move on. You have my permission. Again, if you need somebody with an authoritative voice to tell you that it's okay, this will be posted. You can replay this portion of the video as much as you want. You do not have to respond to everybody who approaches you when they didn't take the time to figure out whether the approach was appropriate. Another thing that is useful when somebody approaches you with something that's not quite right, somebody who is worth responding to, is to make a counteroffer. So maybe you can't say yes to the thing that they want, but you could say yes to something else. Feel free to go ahead and say, look, I can't do that, but I could do this. Would this take care of what you need? This can be particularly useful with clients who may not be familiar with the kind of work that you're working in. So anybody who's working with somebody who's starting off a self-publishing career, they might not know what they're asking for when they're asking for you to help them out with their cover. Or they may not know what they're asking for when they're asking for particular kinds of editing. And so they may show up having done some research and having some vocabulary and be like, hey, I want you to do jargon. And you might not do jargon, but you possibly do, I'm out of the word jargon now. You might do something that is jargon adjacent and probably the thing that they actually want. And so you could say, hey, no, I'm sorry, I don't do full cover illustration, but if what you need is cover design and layout based off stock art images, I do in fact have availability for that. And it could be the case they go, oh yes, actually that's the thing that I needed the whole time. And now you're having a conversation and you're potentially getting that work. And so instead of sitting there and being like, oh, do I want to suddenly become a cover illustrator? You assert your boundary and you say, what I actually do is this. And you may discover that that's what they were asking for all along. They just didn't know it. And so it can kind of be in your interest sometimes to keep the door open and reframe your no as a no but, or a no however, or whatever. Rule of thumb, I wouldn't spend more than 15 minutes drafting an email where what you're saying is that you're not taking the work. That is putting an awful lot of work into turning down work if you're doing more than 15 minutes. So if you are the kind of person who is inclined to be very thoughtful and really worry about letting a person down or disappointing their expectations, this can easily take up a whole lot of your time. But literally what you are doing is turning down work. So it's not really in your interests to have turning down work take up a lot of your working time. So feel free to set a timer and commit to yourself that when the timer beeps, you're sending whatever it is you have drafted. So you had better have something that can be sent by the time that happens. And then just say no and move on. In the grand scheme of things, people don't remember, people hear no so much more often than they hear yes, that the no's are pretty easy to forget. They run together. In 5 years' time, they may not even remember whatever the quick, sorry, I can't do that, I'm not available right now, email thing was. It's not going to have made that much of an impression. And so it's really not going to reward that extra time that you put into it. And a lot of times when you get more elaborate than that, you just sort of invite opportunities for them to read into it things that are not there. And so the more direct and straightforward that you are, the easier it is for them to realize that you are just directly and straightforwardly saying no to this particular opportunity. And you're not kind of inviting the opportunity for them to invent whole scenarios where you hate them. That said, if you do hate them, we can, in a different scenario, talk about ways to communicate that in very Southern style, where you're saying it very outright in ways that only other Southerners understand. I'm kidding. I'm not teaching that seminar where it's not happening. Moving on, scripts. And I think this is possibly the part that a lot of people are here for. We're finally getting to it. But everything else was the legwork to get you to the point where talking about scripts is a thing that we can do. Scripts are something that I really recommend that you have. And I don't necessarily mean that you have to have a file of all of the scripts that you have explicitly written out. A lot of things you'll just sort of naturally develop scripts as you're doing more communicating. And you'll be like, hit the point where you realize you always type the same phrase in response to this. And like that is a script, and being consciously aware of it is useful. But one of the things that's really useful about scripts is they reduce the overhead of communicating in the moment, because what you are going to say is pre-planned for you. And so you just have to drop the right saying into the spot, and then you can move on. And all of the thinking that has to be done in that particular moment has already been done once. And so maybe you spend twice as much time thinking of it the first time, and then 0 time every time subsequently, rather than, a unit of time thinking about it absolutely every time. That pays off for itself very quickly if you do that. This will also leave you more bandwidth for dealing with those kind of unique or subtle or nuanced or one-off situations. When you're developing scripts, it doesn't have to be like, you don't have to develop a whole form letter for a script. You can just have scripted sentences, scripted paragraphs. You could have several scripted paragraphs that you mix and match from. Anybody who's familiar with like old school stories about form rejections, where it was a list and they would just check off the appropriate boxes. You're not going to get away with that by email in, these days. But you can kind of have that sort of same effect going on behind the scenes, where you drop in whichever checkbox things would be on there and run with that. For a script, what matters most in your communication is that it's clear and it's effective and it's easy for you to do. Being responsive matters in a freelancing career, and the more time it takes for you to craft your communication, the less responsive you are. If it takes you an hour to respond to every single email, you are fundamentally less responsive than if it takes you 5 minutes to respond to every email, because it's a 55-minute difference in your minimum response time. Now, some emails take an hour to respond to. Some emails take all day to respond to. That's fine. That happens. That's real. But if every email takes an hour for you to respond to, you probably have an opportunity to develop some scripts that will shorten that for you a little bit. Keep in mind, you're not going to get nominated for a Pulitzer based on your email responses. That there is no category for that. You need to get the point that you're making across. You need to successfully communicate. You don't have to show, even if what you're doing, what your freelancing is writing prose that is eligible for a Pulitzer, even if that is literally the thing that they're soliciting, the email does not have to do that. You want to address the content of what was sent to you. You want to be answering the actual questions that were asked of you, but you don't have to like wow them with your brilliance. You just need to successfully communicate. And there's not a penalty for using the exact same wording in email to editor C that you used for emails to editors A and B, if it was the appropriate response. Even when actually, even if worst case scenario, editors A, B, and C get together and compare the emails they've gotten from you, I'll tell you a real life story. John Joseph Adams is sort of famous for his form responses to when he rejects you from Lightspeed magazine. He actually, I discovered on being submitted to his book imprint, uses the same form letter when he rejects you from his book imprint, even though it's a very different thing, and it was actually your agent who sent it to him and not you. But when the first time my agent forwarded a rejection from John Joseph Adams to me, I took one look at it and then I emailed her back and I was like, that is literally the same form letter he sends me when I submit him short stories. And I have compared this with other writers, and we have all found it hilarious. We don't think John Joseph Adams is a jerk for sending all of us the exact same form letter, regardless of what we have submitted to him. And I guarantee you, the same thing will happen to you if anybody gets together and figures out you're sending the same form letters over and over again. It's one of those, wow, okay, well, they found a communication style that works for them. It got the information across. He's not buying the thing from me. I know what I need to know. I can move on with my day and he can continue like running all of the things that he's doing without being bogged down in constant email communication. So even in the worst case scenario where you are found out and it is a thing that people share over dinner or in random seminars about you, it's fine. Totally okay. So the worst case scenario is still perfectly acceptable. You have permission, go ahead and use scripts. So this is a suggested outline for a form email. And what you're going to need your form email to look like and exactly what it is that you're going to need to do will depend on you. You're probably going to need several of them for different points in communication or different kinds of queries. But here's just sort of a rough out and sort of a suggested format for how you develop your rough out. So the world's most generic form response email ever. Dear person who wrote me. Platitude, this is actually something that I tend to forget when I'm drafting emails. I forget to like remember that the other person is a human being who like is having a life or a day or something. And I tend to just dive right in. So like I actually do have scripts in place where it's like, remember to treat this person like they are a human being. Just because you're sending an email and you haven't seen another human for like a year does not mean that like everybody else turned into robots. And so like that is a thing that I literally go back and add into my emails because I know that this is what I need to communicate effectively. The thing that I'm communicating in this case being that I remember that they are human and not a robot. Other people probably don't struggle to remember that as much as I do, and they will need different things highlighted for their scripting. So, you know, some platitude, and I don't mean this as it's a bad thing by calling it a platitude. Platitudes are actually very important for like effective communication because people don't like talking to people who think that they are robots. They're a lot more likely to have the warm fuzzies and the excitement about hearing from me and like the feeling valued as an individual that I want them to feel if I remember to drop in the platitude. So, you know, something like, I hope that URL is excited about getting the third snowstorm in 10 days as I am. And if not, I hope the view from your window is at least, pretty or something like that, which is a literal platitude I dropped into an email yesterday. Then go ahead. Remember, we want to answer the main question as quickly as possible. So after the platitude, after the demonstration of I remember that you are human, and then go ahead and answer the thing. And as a follow-up, go ahead and do the less concise answer or an explanation or whatever it may be. Next paragraph, depending on what it'll be, make a counteroffer. If you're returning them down, this is the opportunity to make that counteroffer or offer a referral. It can be a place where you ask a question. It can be a place where you ask for the next step, where you're giving them a task. And then an invitation for them to respond. Like, I am listening to you. I'm not just issuing edicts from on high, even if you were the kind of person who is prone to issuing edicts from on high. Third paragraph, sum up everything. And this doesn't have to be like essay style. In conclusion, all the things I said previously, now moving on to the final of the email. It can just be something that kind of ties back into the beginning or reinforces the underlying point of the email in case there's somebody who only reads the last line of the email, which is a thing that actually happens sometimes. Or it makes it easier if they are skimming to get what the gist of the email is, because it's in two places now. And then a summation platitude, because putting your email in a platitude sandwich reemphasizes that sense of you caring about them as a human being, and this being a friendly, positive communication rather than just a straight up, I am a robot who thinks everyone else is a robot kind of thing, even if you're feeling robotic and sometimes forget other humans exist. So that's kind of the rough out for just a suggested template, and the explanation for why. And the reason I gave you the explanation for why is that you can go, all right, well, that doesn't apply to me. Everybody knows that I remember other humans are real, and I can just get to the point and save the warm fuzzies for later on, something like that. Again, anything that I'm sharing here is for you to think about and then accept, modify, or reject as is appropriate for you. So that's why I tend to explain reasoning for stuff, is that it's easy for you to go, oh, those reasons don't apply to me. Or, those reasons make sense, but the execution doesn't seem to line up for me. Do that. So here's an example of an email that you would generate off of that template. And I'm not going to read it to you because I'm assuming that if you managed to register for the seminar, you are sufficiently literate to read it for yourself. And I am not, my kindergarten teacher voice for reading things out loud is not in great shape right now. But this is a pretty straightforward email. And because you've got it scripted out, it's pretty quick to throw together, even though it hits all the points and covers some ground. Honestly, in something like this, the part the hardest for me to remember is the concluding platitude. Like not to remember, but the hardest part for me to formulate. Thank you up front for thing is a pretty easy platitude, but sort of the ending concluding thing tends to be the most unique part of the email. And that's where I'm sitting there and being like, all right, well, what do I know about this person? What is salient in our relationship? How do I put this together so that, I'm fostering that relationship that I want to have with them? And that is pretty much it for the presentation portion of this. So are there any questions about anything we have covered so far that have not been asked yet? I know some of them have not yet been answered. I'm saving those for the workshop-y portion. So are there any other questions? Okay, I'm not seeing much else in the chat, so we're gonna transition over to the workshop-y portion of the seminar. So everybody who has been watching the recording, thank you very much for coming along so far. I'm gonna go ahead and just pull up this overview for the exercise that we'll be doing. So if you want to do that kind of on your own at home, this is the gist of what you want to be doing. And I've put in little suggestions for how much time you spend on them, because spending more time than that is probably just inviting yourself to obsess over something that should be a little bit more straightforward. And with that, anybody who's watching the recording, I hope you have a nice day. Thank you for coming, and support the Dream Foundry.